Good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Korn. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for coming. I also have to acknowledge a few people, even if there are replications here. First of all, Devora. That was really a phenomenal opening, and thanks for everything you do leading our way in Life Store. I also feel compelled, not just because he's my boss, to thank Professor Halevi, because he's truly one of the visionaries in healthcare that I've ever encountered on two different sides of the Atlantic where I've worked. And I think the city of Jerusalem and the state of Israel owes you a tremendous debt of gratitude. So thank you so much, Yonatan. Before we get to you, I also want to just point out that in back of Yonatan is Shai Ofer and Speaker Rubenstein. But if it's okay, Shai has really been on the ground with us, holding our hands, has been so malleable to our suggestions and helped us to implement things in a very pragmatic and functional way. And thank you so much, Shai, as well. And very last, Jill and Barry. I also feel obliged to tell you that it's just a pleasure to be here. We're going to speak a little bit about hospitals, which is a turnoff for many people. But in Tye's book, he points out that hospital has the same root as hospitality. That it's really, and in fact, in Hebrew too, when we think anybody who celebrates Sukkot knows the stories of the ushpizin, the guests that we bring into our Sukkot. And when we admit someone to the hospital, we are me'ashpez those people. So it's really our obligation to treat them as our guests. And I know I speak for everyone in saying that we truly feel like your guests here, not only like your guests, but like your family. So thanks as well. Okay, Tye, I am thrilled, really, all the way from Canada.
I brought the weather.
Yeah. I'm just really delighted and excited to be speaking to you, and frankly to expose so many people who might not have heard some of your ideas, because I think they're going to be very moved by the things we have to say.
I just wanted to add also both Jill and Barry, thanking them for having me. Jill, we've spent some fantastic time together just recently talking about a lot of amazing ideas, and so to continue the conversation is fantastic. And I'd also, again, like to mention Shai and Zvikna. Shai and Zvikna are extraordinary partners, probably the best partners I've worked with anywhere throughout my career, and we've done, I think, some good things together.
Okay, so I'm going to start. For those who don't know, Tye is about to embark on his speaking tour with this soon-to-be bestseller called Constructing Health. I read it on 3 Shabbatot, and I was thinking about this interview. So because I'm Dati, you'll see every page has about 12 Post-it notes, which are, of course, things I don't remember now, but at the time they seemed important. So I want to start with an essay that you quote. I'm just going to read about 1.5 minutes worth of an essay you quote from a book by Matthew Teller called The 9 Quarters of Jerusalem. The piece is entitled Cumin. All my life, Cumin was associated with my first trip to Jerusalem. I was only a child then, but I guess the city I saw in 1980 was very different from the city of today. What I have in my mind's eye from then is a scatter of impressions. Jagged stones worn smoother under so many feet. Gaudy colors and textures hung high overhead in the narrow alleyways. My father doing something he wouldn't dream of doing today, changing money at a Palestinian booth near Damascus Gate. And the smells, sweet things, burnt things, rotting things, laundry soap, hot breads, smells I knew nothing about. It was years later, at a time when spices had become a more normal thing for a suburban London family to use, that I was finally able to attach a name to the earthy scent that I'd filed away in my head for years as Jerusalem. So that's what it was, cumin. Then as now, cumin's crimson brown sniff of old warmth would transport me mentally to the middle of Jerusalem's old walled city, at the crossroads of so many markets and bazaars. Everything was there: gold, fabrics, fresh fruit, fresh meat, new people, new faces, new languages, new ways of being. I watched, but I didn't understand. I didn't know how much I didn't know. That was cumin. For years, I put cumin in everything. Really, I was putting Jerusalem in everything. That is such an evocative piece for me, and I'm wondering why you put it in this book and how it speaks to you.
But you read that, and I start tasting the bread. The smell, the spices that you put on the bread, the textures, the sounds, all of that, they come rushing back. I think of the market, the main food market. That's a place that I love to go. Why do I love to go there? Because there's something that sticks up here with me that is extremely vivid. When you get into a little bit of research on brain science, it's called eidetic imagery. Eidetic imagery is very different, so I've discovered, than what we think of a memory of a place. It's a photograph. And you can think of, if I say a starry night, maybe you can think of going somewhere where you saw the starry night, or other things you can think of at different times. But there's some of these images of places that you go to that when you hear about them, you can taste it, you can scent it, you can smell it, you can hear the sound. We can think of some of those places that are our favorite places, and they come rushing back like a wave towards us. And the question is, why is that? I mean, I certainly wasn't taught that in architecture school. You know, the relationship of environments and health and well-being, we throw those words around. You know, what is health and what is well-being? To your point about, you know, architecture and design in hospitals, you know, in my early days, I would go to a cocktail party and I would say to somebody, they'd say, well, what do you do? And I say, well, I design hospitals. And I would look at them and their eyes would sort of, you know, turn around and they say, hospitals aren't designed, they're planned. I mean, I've been through them. And why is that? I mean, a lot of hospitals are fantastic, but we have a sense that maybe they're not. And so, you know, what is health in our mind's eye? What is well-being? We throw these words around, but I'm not so sure we know much about them. So I wanted to discover that. But then suddenly what happens very quickly is that we find health and well-being instantly connects straight up to one spot. And that's up into our mind's eye, because everything is coming through here. And so, but I mean, I certainly as an architect wasn't taught about the mind and perception and cognition and how do environments make you feel and how do they make you feel better? I mean, how do they tie together towards performance? So I started diving into that because we had designed something that was a hospital that seemed to get some recognition, because when people walked in, it added an extra spring to their step, and there seemed to be some connection between, as you've been diving into with radiology, on the relationship of place and emotion. And so we began to dive into that, and what I discovered fairly quickly is there's something that's called enriched environments, or environmental enrichment. Didn't really know what that was about. But what it tied back to, a very simple thing, was about little mice. And one guy took lab rats back from his medical research, and he brought them into something that you'd probably have at home that had lots of toys and things that were playing around. And he studied them compared to the ones that were in a regular cage or those that were in what's known as impoverished environments. And in fact, he found, as a result, this went through the University of California, Berkeley, when they dissected the brains of these mice, what they found is the ones that were in enriched environments, the cortex that wraps around the brain, which is very important around the connections of synapses. The ones that were enriching environments, the cortex had grown 6% greater than the ones that were in the regular ones. And in fact, the ones that were in the impoverished ones, it began to wither like a plant because of the environment. Your brain's growing and changing. So suddenly is there something we should be looking at as architects that can dive deeper into what we're calling in our research is about the elements of enriched environments and how can we create the conditions of where we can thrive and flourish as a result of the things that I do as an architect that I didn't know anything about. I wasn't trained or really aren't commonly known. But I'll say that we all know that in our gut. We all know the environments that we walk into, the ones that make us feel extraordinary, the ones that we want to stay and talk and linger and spend more time together, that increase empathy, social interaction, which we could use a little bit of that some of these days on how we begin to debate and discuss and share in different things.
Let me challenge you on that, though. So you make a good case for enriched environments, but you designed this lovely cancer center for us, and wouldn't it be correct to assume that the average patient with cancer just wants to get treatment, wants to get his or her treatment? I mean, where do you come, it almost seems incongruous to me, where do you come off layering on these other issues?
Well, interestingly, when we think of how do we design where we work, where we play, where we live, or a cancer center, for example, when we start that, we say, okay, what are we designing? Well, we need a number of radiation treatment bunkers there. Okay, check. We need spaces for this, that. Okay, check. What else is important with designing a cancer center? Well, it's got to be on time and it's got to be on budget. Okay, what else does it need to be? Well, maybe it should radiate what our values are. When we started doing a master plan, I remember very distinctly what you said, was that it wasn't just about doctoring and the medicine or the technology, but it was the human touch. It was the embrace, because those things are the things that begin to give us a sense of coherence and purpose. And so, as was mentioned at the outset, there's this idea of salutogenesis. And so what is salutogenesis? Well, it was invented, the concept, by an American-Israeli doctor, in fact, I think who was one of the founding members of the Ben Gurion Medical School, if I'm not mistaken. Salutogenesis is really the opposite of pathogens or pathogenic. We all know what pathogens are. Who knows about salutogenesis? It's not known. Patho and genesis is made up of two words. Patho is disease, and genesis is the beginning or the origins. And this guy began to look and study on why some people went through some very terrible events, including the Holocaust. And he began to try and understand why people went through some things that were exceptional in a bad way, but they had an ability to see themselves and understand how they could move through that and see themselves as a whole with these terrible things that are happening. And he defined it, the main idea, which you know very well, is this idea of a sense of coherence, that you can make sense of who you are, your life, and you can see a way forward through it. And it ties to elements around comprehensibility, meaningfulness, as key concepts around that. Meaning, it's really sort of a sense of purpose. So let's put it as a simple way that if you wake up in the morning and you don't have a sense of coherence or purpose, you're not going to get out of bed in the morning. If you do have it, you're going to get up, you know where you want to go, you know what you have to do, and you have a will to go forward. When you're dealing with cancer or a whole variety of other things, the carpet has been pulled out from under you, and you don't see a way forward. And so what are the things, and you're beginning to prove it in your research also, that ties to hopefulness, which is extraordinary, in the sense that what you've discovered is with hopefulness, which is a sense of coherence and a sense of purpose moving forward, is that you can begin to construct a way which gives you that extra spring in your step, but it also has physiological and psychological impacts on your body, which is clearly known. And so if we can begin to infuse it, you're doing it in your work, but what's the role of architecture? What's my role in that? Mm-hmm. In the sense that, and we were talking a little bit earlier about that this new cancer center has some of the greatest people that will treat you, some of the best processes, medicine, the medical equipment, and all of that, so that there is a sense that if you go there, you're going to get a great treatment. But let's turn that around and have a parallel between the cancer center and the treatment that you're getting there. And let's talk about a restaurant. So if you walk into a restaurant tomorrow night for a meal and you walk through the threshold of the door and you smell something amazing, and you look and maybe there's flowers or a display and there's a beautiful view and there's sound or music and you hear chatter, suddenly what happens is you began to perceive, before you've actually gone past the lobby, that the food and the meal that you're going to have is going to be extraordinary. All of these things are communicating messages to you, and your mind's eye, begins to, because that's the way our brain works, is you begin to construct, you begin to predict because of inputs. There are inputs through all of your senses. Your brain is very efficient. It then begins to make a prediction of what you should do, which gets back to the idea, ancient thing, should you run or should you stay? But it predicts that you will have a fantastic outcome as a result of it.
You make this statement in the book that architecture and design are never neutral. And it kind of made me wonder, what it is like to, spend time with you, like invite you to my house. Like, what are you going to think? I mean, this is a great place, but what are you going to think about what I chose? Because, obviously those neurons are firing.
I was thinking, how do I get a reservation in this spot? Now I know where to stay.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
But I think what's the important message about it is, and we get back to the Cancer Center, is we have to communicate, I believe, in the environments that we create, we have to communicate different messages of things that can feed through here, that can fill out the prediction of what is the experience that you're going to have. We design a lot of education facilities and other things. Is what's the role on the space in an education facility that will help encourage interaction, curiosity, on and on. A lot of the schools we went to, we were talking earlier, described as cells and bells. They're a box, you line up, you look at somebody and they feed you information. That's not the way we learn. It's the exact opposite. It's sort of an industrial model that came from the Industrial Revolution. But what we need to do, and part of the reason for the book, is to begin to open your eyes to the possibilities of what your environments are and to demand more, because once you see something, you can't unsee it.
How do you account for, we're about 35 people here, for the differences that invariably we bring to whatever experience it is that you're designing? You have this notion in the book, which I was fascinated by, that you term positive ambiguity. This idea that we're trained not to be ambiguous, we're trained to be much more forthright in our thinking, and yet you bless the notion of ambiguity.
Well, there's a couple of things on it. Let's first go back to that we're all different, and certainly in the architecture and the neuroscience degree, we had a lot of debate around this. So back to the idea, how does the constructed theory of emotion, which is very important to me, it's by a Canadian by birth in the States, written a couple of great books, but there's inputs that come in from all of our senses, and they come in and our brain begins to absorb those, and we make predictions on what we do with it, as I mentioned before. But all of those things are filtered through what we've learned and experienced in the past. So some of them are experiential things and some of them are cultural or overlays. All of those things are the filters that begin to predict, is this a place I want to stay or be, or is it a place that I want to get out of there? And so that's where in the elements of enriched environments, which is in our work, is that we began to look at what are some of the characteristics and qualities of things that become more universal. And so the analogy that I use, which goes back to food and cooking, is that these elements are very much like spices that you can infuse. They're not things that are rigid. And so what do I mean by that? And so think of cinnamon. Well, cinnamon, for me, I think of sort of winter. And I think of the holidays, and I think of a spiced goose and maybe spiced wine. And all of those things relate to me. But cinnamon has sort of that woody, sort of earthy, sort of mild flavor to it. But if I think of an Indian biryani, uses a lot of cinnamon. The Indian biryani, or the perception of how that is used for a celebration or something else, is very different. Or if I think of the Caribbean, and a double meat patty uses the same thing. There's different interpretation, but that taste on our lips is very similar, and we can get into sweetness or another a number of other things. And so what that goes back to, which we discovered in our research, is how it relates to emotions and how we can begin to look at space and the qualities of space that are on more of the positive side of the emotional side of our experiences. Not that the negative side aren't important. And I'll give you a very good example of it. A building that I find extraordinary is the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and one specific area of it. Why is it? Because it's extremely unsettling. One spot specifically where you walk across, it's an Israeli artist that has the metal cutouts of the faces. You walk across that, you're unsettled, there's the clanging, it's disruptive. That moves you very specifically for a purpose of a realization of something. And so that would be on the side that, is less of what I talk about, is more on the positive side. And the reason I'm talking on the positive side is a lot of those negative things that we experience in our buildings are done unintentionally, but they make us feel unsettled and discomfort. And so the question is, how can we work on the other side of the emotion side to begin to have that more positive effect?
It's not surprising that an architect like yourself, I'm counting here, has used the word space about 9 times already in the first 20 minutes. And you make a distinction between space and place. And I thought that was very profound, and I wonder if you could share that with us.
I think it's a key one. And so if we think of what is your house made up of? Okay, well, it's got a kitchen, it's got a living room, it's got a dining room, it's got a bathroom, garage, or something else. That ties back to really sort of René Descartes and that sort of rational view that everything is Cartesian, that it can be measured, and a very specific sort of, and it's clearly gone into, rational thought, and in fact, into medicine, I would argue, too, science, definitely. But if we go back to your home, what is the home? Well, it's a place that you have parties and celebrations and an event like tonight. It's places where you have those big celebrations, but it has very intimate things, and places where it's very private, and it is your own cocoon that's outside of everywhere else. Well, that's really the difference between space is, okay, what's the functional thing? We need all of these pieces and we put them together. That's how a lot of places are planned, a lot of building types. And so we put the place, we've connected them, they work functionally fantastic. It's done and finished. Well, that's not it's the other parts that can supercharge what happens and a discussion together that you want to stay and you want to spend more time with, and empathy and meaning and back to the values of an organization, that when you walk in the door, that it begins to radiate to you immediately what is important to you. And that arguably has never been more important, certainly in the froth that we find ourselves now, and arguably coming out of COVID also, where we felt that the ground was unsettled under us, is how can we get back to that sense of coherence that's tied back to that idea of salutogenesis?
It seems like you then take it to this next step because you point out that maybe unwittingly, all of us have a relationship to place. And you characterize those relationships as being either positive or negative. And then you sort of toggle back and forth in your writing with our relationships to each other, interpersonal relationships, and our relationships in space. Now, you've been to Israel probably about 15 times. I know your Hebrew's getting much better. But we have a notion also of ben adam lechavero, which is the relationship I have with my peers, and ben adam lamakom, which usually is interpreted as my relationship to God, but God being like the ultimate, if you believe in that entity, the ultimate condition of space. And if I'm not mistaken, and I'd like you to elaborate on it, you challenge us to think about what are the positive dimensions of our relationships with other people, like trust or generosity, and can we replicate that in our relationships with spaces? Did I get that right or not?
You did. And so when I was doing my thesis, so I was a fly-in student, I was running our practice in Toronto. We work across Europe, Israel. Thankfully, we've been working here for probably over 20 years. And I was a fly-in student doing this Master of Neuroscience. It's fantastic being taught by some of the greatest neurosciences, cognitive science, and the rest. So doing the thesis, I was getting into this idea of enriched environments, environmental enrichment. And working with me on the thesis was a psychologist and a sociologist. And we began to start looking at how we form person-to-person relationships. And this psychologist began to look at meaningful patient-to-doctor interactions and what were the qualities and the characteristics of those things. And what she discovered was there was a handful of things. One is this idea around generosity and sort of legacy. Generosity, you can think of a relationship with somebody you've had, a mentor. That's being very meaningful and giving. Goes into others around variety and vitality, relationships that have that, that buoyancy, that effervescence to it. It goes into other ideas around authenticity. You can think of relationships that are very real and rich and have the depth with them. These ideas of hope, hopefulness, relationships that are natural also. You can think of the people that are, that are so easy. And that moves down into, really characteristics that are the excitement side of it down to more of the quiet side, the stillness, the solidness, and an intimacy. And you can think of the relationships that you have that are like that. Curiously, as we were beginning to look at the space and the characteristics and the qualities of those relationships, interestingly, they're very similar to the elements of enriched environments that we resonate with. So as we got further into it, is how does the brain construct relationships person to person? Interestingly, the way our brain, or I should say our mind, constructs relationship person to place are very, very similar. So let's think of an example of that. Think of back to that mentor that has helped you out so much in your career, and that quality of generosity, somebody who's giving without asking, that is helping you with no other purpose. They're not getting anything back from you. They're just doing that as a gift to you, really. Now let's think of an architectural space. Think of walking down a street that has 6 lanes of traffic, that has a very narrow sidewalk. The windows are all boarded up. There's no canopy or anything. The cars are going back. All you're smelling is the cars and all of that. Is that a generous space? Well, clearly it's not. So then let's think of some spaces that you walk down to. Maybe there's the cobblestones and you can hear your feet. There's some trees for some shadow. There's a bench to sit on. There's a canopy or a colonnade that will cover you if it's raining. There's a cafe that the seats are spilling out. You can smell that coffee, the bread that we talked about earlier. You want to stay and linger and being there because this space is generous to you.
Is generosity contagious?
Generosity is definitely contagious. And in fact, I think generosity is the key piece of architecture, which the book is called An Exploration of Generosity. But what is generosity then as it relates to space? Well, is that, well, we need more of something, that everything should be bigger. Is that what generosity is? No. In fact, a lot of it is doing more with the same things that everybody else is doing. Generosity also relates to the ability for you to take it and interpret it and maybe move it around or change it as it is based on your lifestyle. There's a famous architect in Chile that built these half houses. And the idea was that half of it was built with space, the rest had a roof and a wall around it. But as your family began to grow, you could fill in and expand another bedroom or living room or something else. That's generous architecture also. Mm-hmm. Generous architecture also is not about just the building and the design. It's about the process, or what we call this saludo-systemic approach, which is the ability to bring more voices in around the table. When we did the master plan a while back at Shared Executive, we had probably 50 different people from a whole range of different backgrounds, and everybody had a voice, and we began to harness that energy together in a direction. That's instead of me coming saying, here's the greatest design, why don't you build that? Because that's my idea. So all of these things need to tie together. And I think that concept of generosity, which I think we see that is there doesn't seem to be a lot of generosity in our society these days.
Yeah, there's a great picture.
You're on any continent.
There's a great picture at the end of the book. I think it's the last color plate, which has the leaders of the hospital of Shared Tzedek, and you created like this model, and they're immersing themselves in it. And so, without getting into names, some of the people, are somewhat. I don't really see them smiling and playful all the time, but somehow you brought that out of them.
I think there's two things. I mean, we work with huge models, and we don't come in with a scheme. We bring in the model, we bring in the blocks, and we say, where should the front door be? Where should the shipping and receiving? What should the pieces be in between? One client somewhere along the way said, Tye, don't you have a degree in Harvard? Like, why are you playing with blocks? Shouldn't you be coming in with
Stop with the Lego.
Stop with the Lego. But it is, in fact, specifically about the Lego. Because if you put up PowerPoint, slides and all the rest of it, everybody begins to drift out and begins to think that, oh, here we go, I'm pushing information to you. When you bring out the models and the blocks, everybody comes to the table instantly and said, are we playing with Lego blocks? Yeah. And so what's important about that? What happens is, in the mind's eye, there's a curiosity that suddenly you're coming to the table, that this isn't work, that this is something that's creative, it's fun. The only problem with this process is you have to lay out very quickly at the outside is that you can't hog all the blocks yourself. You have to share them. And there's some.
How did our people do with that?
They did, for the most part, very well, once we established the rules.
I'm glad to see there are some questions coming in from the audience. So I don't know if this one is a downer or if it's uplifting, but I'm going to read it. Is there a universally recognized type of space to die?
Well, when we were together in Liverpool about a month or so ago, we had a discussion about health and death, depending on the culture you're in, it's something we don't want to touch, we don't want to talk about, certainly in going through treatment. That's something that's taboo. And we also talked that there's a variety of other cultures that celebrate it and embrace it in very meaningful ways. But I'd like to turn that back around to that earlier discussion, is less, and back to the idea that we all interpret things in very different ways as a person, but also because of past experience and cultural things. The answer to that question, I think, is turning it around back to, like, if someone said, okay, if we're going to design a building for a stage of death, my question would be is, okay, what do we want to communicate? What do we want to radiate out about the emotional relationship of what death means to the people that are coming there? And so it might be about quietness and stillness and reflection. It may be something that might be more celebratory, as certainly we know in a lot of religious buildings we experience. But shouldn't we be diving deeper into what is that emotional response we want to communicate about this very important part of that experience? Mm-hmm. Because I think it's very different to all of us at different times of what death is, if it was predicted or not, and what the cultural overlay should be around it.
Right. What about, some of us follow a weekly cycle of reading portions from the scripture, from the Torah, and recently we finished describing and understanding the tabernacle. Do you have a concept of sacred space, whether it's a religious concept, a spiritual concept? Is it your goal to sanctify space?
Well, in the cancer center that we built, and a lot of the buildings, this idea of a sacred in a different way, taking sacred away from religion, meaning that how do spaces move you? So how is it when you walk through a threshold and all of the sound and the chatter and everything else that is around you, how does it begin to move you to realize something else? In fact, the main purpose, I think, of what we should be doing in the sense of building is make us aware that we're alive. Make us sense and aware of the sounds and the smells and the movements and the passing of the sun, in the day. The cancer center, which Shine's Vicna we designed, which I'm very excited with, is that it's a very moody building. But the sun in the morning, in the night, in the fall, in the depths of winter, it plays the shadows against everything. It's always different. And if you come in one day to the next day, you notice it. And what are you noticing? You're noticing light. We created a radiation treatment bunker, one of 7 in the world, that has a skylight in it. Why? Because if a cloud goes in front of the sun, the place pulsates. And what does that communicate? Life. And so if we think of the sacred spaces that are transformational, usually they're religious buildings, or in fact, they're tied with fancy buildings of some, you think of art galleries or, I don't know, other things such as that. But how can you take these characters and qualities and bring them to things that are just would be seen as more common, everyday things that make you feel that you're alive, that you sense your surroundings? And I say I live about 10 minutes from the office, and I religiously walk there day in and day out, and even in the biggest storms. And my family says, you're crazy. And they say, why are you doing that? I say, I want to feel that I'm alive. Even if it is stormy or all the rest, or now the birds are coming out and you sense it. Maybe I should change that policy a little bit, but it's all about that.
You clearly, in the Cancer Center, brought the outside to the inside, and maybe you could speak a little bit about wood, the gardens, which are a central fulcrum of what you designed, and why you did that.
So it gets back to this idea that you mentioned earlier, and I didn't answer that, around this concept of positive ambiguity that we've developed, that if you get into the literature, the mind really, really enjoys. So what's a simple example of positive ambiguity? And do you know that thing that you've seen, that you look at it and it looks like a black vase? But if you look at it the other way, it looks like two faces that are looking at each other. Our mind really loves that, because you see the one thing and then the other comes into view and it really excites you. There's a whole lot of examples and experiences around that. As we get further into that, what we do find that nature does a lot of that. And nature, there's a guy on the West Coast, Taylor is his name, who researches these fractal patterns, which gets down to nature. And there's what's called a sweet spot of fractal patterns. And so what's a fractal pattern? As you know, you see a tree trunk that goes into branches, then it goes into little branches, and then it gets into the vines or the veins on a leaf. Some fractal patterns really stimulate us because you can begin to make sense of them. If they become too complex, they're confusing. If they're too simple, we get bored. What's an example of fractal patterns that have a real sweet spot? And this guy has studied them. Jackson Pollock paintings, all of the paints. Why do they sell for tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars? Like they're paint circled around. Why do they radiate so much to them and spend a lot of money on them? This guy has studied them, and he has found that they are absolutely in the visual sweet spot in our mind's eye of the things that really, really stimulate us. There are other things.
I think he compares it, you say in the book, to forests.
Forests that's right. And so there are two concepts that tie together to voluntary and involuntary perception, which ties back to these same concepts. When you go into the forest, the involuntary, which is really all the stuff around you that you're not really focusing on, which would be called atmosphere, or this German word called Stimmung, which is like that sort of, the mist that comes in or goes away. All of that stuff in a forest, all of that texture and background is the stuff that regenerates us. And so if you think of, in Japan, there's this idea of forest bathing. That's what all of that stuff is. That's the involuntary. The voluntary is when you're staring at your phone or your computer and you're concentrating and it wears you out. The other stuff is the stuff that ties you up. All of this ties back into nature. What is nature? Well, nature, a lot of us have heard of biophilia. The Harvard professor, E.O. Wilson, that said we have this innate connection to natural forms and natural shapes and all of it. So in architecture, what it means, and certainly in a hospital design, you hear a lot about healing gardens. Sadly, what you see is a lot of pieces of grass, and somebody checks the box and says, okay, I've got a healing garden. Does that mean if I go out and I roll in it, it will heal me? Well, it's not. It's obviously much deeper. So it's natural materials, it's natural shapes and natural forms. So if you look at the cancer center, for example, there's a lot of wood. Why wood? Because in our mind's eye, it relates to things that are very old, that have grown. Maybe it relates to forest and natural things. The natural shapes and the natural forms, again, in our mind's eye, they're really stimulating, and there's a lot of play associated with that. You think of, stone or a wooden table, you think of quality. Again, all of these things are communicating messages specifically to what's going to happen and the experience, and they're deeply, deeply rooted within us.
Yeah. I mean, we hear your passion, and I think you make the point, and all of us know. Like, we look at the beautiful limestone here, but in Jerusalem there are these ordinances that I think you had to challenge to be able to introduce so much wood. The joke in the Cancer Center is that you insisted that the wood come from Scandinavia. You said you didn't mind if it would come from Norway, Finland, or Sweden, as long as it didn't come from IKEA. Is that true?
Well, I would say some things begin to take on a life of themselves. I think if I was asked, I said, why is it coming from Canada? Not that that comes into unconscious biases, I suppose.
Right.
Interestingly, when we started talking about the design of the Cancer Center, we developed a whole range of different options. And originally, we looked at building it out of stone. And if we built it out of stone, you had to put it on a steel armature. Then we began to look at terracotta, like bricks. You can begin to bend it. It still needs armature. Then we began to look at steel and some of the issues, though, around steel itself. Then we found that we could build it out of wood. We could have curved shapes and on and on and on. And in fact, it's cost effective compared to the other materials that were used. And so it was chosen because it was cost effective. It could get compelling forms that communicate to you. It's a natural material, on and on and on. But all of these things were layered together.
Yeah, and you're constantly, I think, challenging us and taking risks with it. Like I didn't pay attention to it until I read it, but there's this lovely facade, which is an abstract butterfly that you designed. And I didn't realize until I read it, that the butterfly is asymmetrical. And that, again, maybe again with this positive ambiguity, is actually more nourishing to me than if it would be this perfect two-winged entity.
Well, and the butterfly has taken on, I think, a life of itself as a metaphor, and our brain, again, likes metaphors. It makes life a lot easier in metaphors. And so why a butterfly? You can think of, in fact, some hospitals, one specifically in Jerusalem, that I won't name it, but that when you walk up to the front door, it has a glass facade, it's big, the space between it is reasonably tight, and it feels, at least to me, it's got its chest out towards you. And
you could name it.
And that's communicating something, meaning when I come up to it, it's speaking to me about something, and this building, which is a butterfly, it's asymmetrical, it's made out of wood, it's not made out of stone. And why a butterfly? Well, if we go to the metaphor, it's there's a couple things over it. A butterfly is very, very fragile, but it is also one of the most beautiful, magical things of creation. It's very light, it's fragile, and isn't that a metaphor for our lives? You know, they're beautiful and they're magical and fantastic, but they're also very fragile.
Oh.
And it is asymmetrical because life isn't perfect, and it's not that. So why can't a building begin to communicate that we are fragile, but we also are wonderful as a result of it? And so the butterfly began to develop itself in that idea, and I think it's a bit of a curious message, but it gets back to, I think, the real values of that place, which is about the human touch and, you know, holding somebody's hand and the discussion of what you're going through, as opposed to, okay, you're a container for a disease and I'm going to treat whatever's inside of you, as opposed to really the whole person.
Right. So, okay, we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and you know, when I do these interviews with such stimulating people like you, it's always my challenge, and here it was so easy to see if I can do it without going back to my notes. So I try never to use the notes until the last 5 minutes. The last 5 minutes, and I didn't tell you this, but I like to play a game, which is called, I call it, what speaks to you more? So if you're willing to play with me, then what I'm going to do is...
I don't think I have a choice.
Not really.
Anybody want to sell it?
So
Let's see how it goes.
So I have 5 comparators, and I'm just going to throw them out to you. I'm not going to help you at all. And you'll just tell me what speaks to you more. If you like, you know, you can tell us why. But if not, you can just say, you know, like a Rorschach test. Okay, so here we go. Sky or earth?
Sky.
Okay. Want to elaborate?
If you get back to that idea of Stimmen, if you, you know, there's no place on earth and no time throughout the year where everything's exactly the same. Light is one of the key pieces that gives us extraordinary energy as it increases our learning, but it's also the magical side. If you think of light simply, there's a study of 2,000 classrooms, 20,000 students. The classrooms that had better daylight as opposed to glare, the students performed 20% better in math and 25% better in reading or literature because of the quality of light. And so for me, the light, the changing light, seasons, all of that, back to being alive, it's the key piece.
Okay, my next one is Calatrava's Bridge of Strings in Jerusalem or the London Bridge in London?
They both have different meaning. Calatrava, his is unexpected, I think, when you come into the city, and unexpected in, I think, a hopeful way. So it moves me more than the London Bridge does because of that overlay. And interestingly, if you think of that building in a very ancient city, it's somewhat provocative, I think, albeit it seems to, I don't know what the general belief is, but it seems to have some sense of place here.
Yeah, you certainly can't ignore it. Brain or mind?
Definitely mind.
Okay.
But I think we should define that. I think this is a really interesting part, is what's the difference between the two of them? Is your brain housed in your skull, or is it embodied? And that's a very different, and we talk a lot about that in the book, is that your brain is an organ, your mind is obviously the operating, the software, as it were. And the whole idea that the mind is embodied is a very important concept, because your gut, you know, that gut feeling, well, this thing is very important. Let me just step back a bit. You know, what's the difference between emotions, feelings, and moods? I was never taught. I thought they were all the same thing. Your body, if we hear a loud bang behind us or a loud noise behind us and we're startled, what happens? My heart starts going.
Racing.
I start breathing faster. Probably the blood sugar starts racing because it's going to encourage me to move. That is an emotion. Your body has an emotional response. And your body begins to tell your mind something by all this pumping. Your mind then begins to say, what am I supposed to do with this? And so that is then that goes from the emotion to the feeling. So what do I mean by that? If it's a loud bang and I turn around and it's a friend of mine in a funny costume, would I go from that surprise to sort of a joy side? If I turn around and I see it's a guy with a knife that's just broken into the house, it then goes from surprise to fear. Then that is a feeling that begins to tell us what we should be doing as a result of it. And I think those definitions are very important, back to that idea.
All right. Okay, we have only about 45 seconds left because Zoom dictates everything now, but the last one for you, okay, the last one I'll give you is civility or disruption?
All in the above.
Fair enough. Tye Farrow, thanks so much.